Hello everyone. Today we'll discuss about the wildlife sanctuaries in India. If you have not yet subscribed to my channel, please subscribe, like, share and comment. Okay, let us start. Wildlife sanctuaries in Andaman and Nicobar Island, Ariel Island, Bamboo Island, Barren Island Wildlife Sanctuary, Batimalu Island Wildlife Sanctuary, Belle Wildlife Sanctuary, Bennett Wildlife Sanctuary, Bingan Island Wildlife Sanctuary, Blister Island Wildlife Sanctuary, Bluff Island Wildlife Sanctuary, Bondville Brush Island Wildlife Sanctuary, Bachnan Island Wildlife Sanctuary, Channel Island Wildlife Sanctuary, Inkway Island Wildlife Sanctuary, Clyde Island Wildlife Sanctuary, Cone Island Wildlife Sanctuary, Keoladeo Island Wildlife Sanctuary, Keoladeo Island Wildlife Sanctuary, Cuthbert Bay Wildlife Sanctuary, Defense Island Wildlife Sanctuary, Dot Island Wildlife Sanctuary, Dotterel, Duncan, East Island, east of English Island, Egg Island Wildlife Sanctuary, Entrance Island Wildlife Sanctuary, Flat Island Wildlife Sanctuary, Gander Island, Girjan, Gelte Bay Wildlife Sanctuary, Goose Island Wildlife Sanctuary, Hump, Interview Island Wildlife Sanctuary, James Island Wildlife Sanctuary, Jungle Island, Kwangtung Island Wildlife Sanctuary, Khyad Island Wildlife Sanctuary, Landfall Island Wildlife Sanctuary, La Touch, Loha Bharak Wildlife Sanctuary, Mangrove Island Wildlife Sanctuary, Mask Island, Mayo Island, Megapod Island Wildlife Sanctuary, Monte Jeremy Island Wildlife Sanctuary, Knockandam, North Brother, North Island, North Reef, Olive Island Wildlife Sanctuary, Orchid Wildlife Sanctuary, Oxide Wildlife Sanctuary, Oyster, First Wildlife Sanctuary, Oyster Second Wildlife Sanctuary, Paget Wildlife Sanctuary, Parkinson Island Wildlife Sanctuary, Passage, Patrick Peacock Island Wildlife Sanctuary, Pittman Island Wildlife Sanctuary, Point Wildlife Sanctuary, Potanma Island Wildlife Sanctuary, Ranger, Reef, Roper Island Wildlife Sanctuary, Rose, Roe, Sandy, Sea Serpent, Shark Island Wildlife Sanctuary, Sherman Island Wildlife Sanctuary, Sir Hug Rose Island Wildlife Sanctuary, Sisters Island Wildlife Sanctuary, Snake, First and Second Wildlife Sanctuaries, South Brother Island Wildlife Sanctuary, South Reef, South Sentinel, Spike Island First Wildlife Sanctuary, Spike Island Second Wildlife Sanctuary, Stoat, Surat Island Wildlife Sanctuary, Swamp Island Wildlife Sanctuary, Table Island Wildlife Sanctuaries. This is Lilangarno and this is Excelsior. Next, Talabacha Island Wildlife Sanctuary, Temple Island Wildlife Sanctuary, Tilong Chang, Tree Island, Trill Bay, Tuft, Turtle West Island, Wharf, White Cliff Island Wildlife Sanctuaries. These are the wildlife sanctuaries which are situated in the Andaman and Nicobar Island. Next we'll see wildlife sanctuaries in Andhra Pradesh. Kolleru Bird Sanctuary, Nelpattu Bird Sanctuary, Pulkat Lake Bird Sanctuary, Koringa Wildlife Sanctuary, Nagarjuna Sagar, Srisailam Tiger Reserve, Sri Venkateshwara National Park, Rolapadu Wildlife Sanctuary, Sri Lankamaleshwar Wildlife Sanctuary, Krishna Wildlife Sanctuary, Kondania Wildlife Sanctuary, Gundla Brahmeshwaram Wildlife Sanctuary, Sri Penusila Narasimha Wildlife Sanctuary, Kambalkonda Wildlife Sanctuary. Next we'll see wildlife sanctuaries in Arunachal Pradesh. Pakke Tiger Reserve, D. Earring Memorial Wildlife Sanctuary, Itanagar Wildlife Sanctuary, Mehao, Yaglenest Wildlife Sanctuary, Sessa Orchid Sanctuary, Kamlang Wildlife Sanctuary, Dibang Wildlife Sanctuary, Ken Wildlife Sanctuary, Telly Valley Wildlife Sanctuary, Yodia Reb Serpe Wildlife Sanctuary. Next we'll see wildlife sanctuaries in Assam. Garampani Wildlife Sanctuary, Lowakowa Wildlife Sanctuary, Bura Chapori Wildlife Sanctuary, Burnadi, Pobitora, Chakrashila, Pani Dihing Wildlife Sanctuary, Longpur Gibbon Sanctuary, Sonia Rupai Wildlife Sanctuary, East Kirby Anglong Wildlife Sanctuary, Nambur Wildlife Sanctuary, Nambur Diograng Wildlife Sanctuary, Dihing Patkai Wildlife Sanctuary, Amchang Wildlife Sanctuary, Burail Wildlife Sanctuary, Brainstorming, the Porbil Bird Sanctuary, Marat Longri Wildlife Sanctuary. Next we'll see wildlife sanctuaries in Bihar. Bimband Wildlife Sanctuary, Gautam Buddha Wildlife Sanctuary, Pant Wildlife Sanctuary, Udaipur Kaimur Wildlife Sanctuary, Nagi Dham, Nakti Dham, Kanwar Lake Bird Sanctuary, Vikramshila Gangtik Dolphin Sanctuary. Next, Kusheshwar Asthan Bird Sanctuary, Barella Jeel Salim Ali Jub Sahin Bird Sanctuary, Rajauli Wildlife Sanctuary. Next we'll see wildlife sanctuaries in Chandigarh. City Birds Wildlife Sanctuaries, Shukna Lake Wildlife Sanctuaries. Next we'll see wildlife sanctuaries in Chhattisgarh. Sitnadi Wildlife Sanctuary, Achanamka Wildlife Sanctuary, Badalkol, Barnavappar, Tamor Pingla Wildlife Sanctuary, Simasot, Bhairamghar Wildlife Sanctuary, Bhoram Dev, Sarangar Gomarda Wildlife Sanctuary, Pamed Wildlife Buffalo Wildlife Sanctuary, Udanti Wild Buffalo Wildlife Sanctuary. Next we'll see wildlife sanctuaries in Dadra, Nagar Haveli and Daman Diu. Dadra and Nagar Haveli Wildlife Sanctuary and Fudam Bird Sanctuary. Next we'll see wildlife sanctuaries which are in Delhi, Asola Bhati Wildlife Sanctuary and only one, it is repeated here, sorry. Only one wildlife sanctuary is in Delhi, Asola Bhati Wildlife Sanctuary. Next in Goa, Bhagwan Mahavir Sanctuary, Koti Goa Wildlife Sanctuary, Bondla Salim Ali Bird Sanctuary, Madia Wildlife Sanctuary, Netravati Wildlife Sanctuary. Next we'll see in wildlife sanctuaries in Haryana, Bindavas Wildlife Sanctuary, Chilchila Wildlife Sanctuary, Abub Shahar Wildlife Sanctuary, Bir Sheikarghar Wildlife Sanctuary, Nahar Wildlife Sanctuary, Kharparwas Wildlife Sanctuary, Khol Hai Raitan Wildlife Sanctuary. Next we'll see wildlife sanctuaries in Gujarat, Girnar Wildlife Sanctuary, Kutch Desert Wildlife Sanctuary, Narayan Sarovar Sanctuary, Shulpaneshwar Wildlife Sanctuary, Rampar Wildlife Sanctuary, Jessore Sloth Bear, Barda Wildlife Sanctuary, Purna, Hingolgad Nature Education Sanctuary, Ghaga Wildlife Sanctuary, Ratan Mahal Sloth Bear Sanctuary, Khijdiya Bird Sanctuary, Narayan Sarovar Sanctuary, Lal Buster Sanctuary, Porbandar Bird Sanctuary, Purna Wildlife Sanctuary, Thol Lake Bird Sanctuary, Balaram Ambaji Wildlife Sanctuary, Mithial Wildlife Sanctuary, Shulpaneshwar Wildlife Sanctuary, Barda Wildlife Sanctuary, Ghaga Wildlife Sanctuary. And next we'll see wildlife sanctuaries in Himachal Pradesh. Bandli Wildlife Sanctuary, Chail Wildlife Sanctuary, Chandratal Wildlife Sanctuary, Churdar Wildlife Sanctuary, Dharangatti Wildlife Sanctuary, Dauldhar Wildlife Sanctuary, Ghamgul Siabahi Wildlife Sanctuary, Kais Wildlife Sanctuary, Kalatop Khajair Wildlife Sanctuary, Kanwar Wildlife Sanctuary, Kokhan Wildlife Sanctuary, Kibbar, Kugti, Lipa, Asrang, Majathal, Manali, Nargu, Pongdam Lake, Renuka Wildlife Sanctuary, Rupi Baba, Sanj, Sangla, Shech, Thuanala Wildlife Sanctuary, Shikari Devi Wildlife Sanctuary, Shimla Water Catchment, Dharla, Tirtan, Tundha, Rohila Wildlife Sanctuary. Next we'll see wildlife sanctuaries in Jammu and Kashmir. Trikut Wildlife Sanctuary, Surinsar Mansar Wildlife Sanctuary, Ramnagar Rakha Wildlife Sanctuary, Nanni Wildlife Sanctuary, Baltal Thajwas Wildlife Sanctuary, Gulamgarh Wildlife Sanctuary, Hirpur Wildlife Sanctuary, Jarsot Wildlife Sanctuary, Lachipura Wildlife Sanctuary, Limbar Wildlife Sanctuary, Overa Aru Wildlife Sanctuary, Hokersar Wildlife Sanctuary, Rajparin Wildlife Sanctuary, Tral Wildlife Sanctuary. Next we'll see wildlife sanctuaries in Jharkhand. Dhalma Wildlife Sanctuary, Hazaribagh, Gautam Budh Wildlife Sanctuary, Koderma Wildlife Sanctuary, Lavalong, Mahavdaran Wildlife Sanctuary, Palmau Tiger Reserve, Palkot Wildlife Sanctuary, Parasnath Wildlife Sanctuary, Top Chinchi Wildlife Sanctuary, Udhawa Lake Wildlife Sanctuary. Next we'll see wildlife sanctuaries in Karnataka. Adi Chunchanagiri Hills Wildlife Sanctuary, Arbitittu Wildlife Sanctuary, Ativeri Bird Sanctuary, Bhadra Wildlife Sanctuary, Bhimgad Wildlife Sanctuary. Next, Biligiri Ranga Hills, Brahmagiri Wildlife Sanctuary, Kaveri Wildlife Sanctuary, Chincholi Wildlife Sanctuary, Dandeli, Dharoji Sloth Bear, Ghataprabha, Gudavi Bird Sanctuary, Gudekote Wildlife Sanctuary, Malai Mahadeshwar Wildlife Sanctuary, Melkote Temple Wildlife Sanctuary, Mukambika, Nugu, Pushpagiri, Rani Benur Blackbuck Sanctuary, Rangantittu Bird Sanctuary, Ramdevar Vulture Sanctuary, Rangayana Durga 4-horned Antelope Wildlife Sanctuary, Sharavati Valley Wildlife Sanctuary, Shetty Hilly Wildlife Sanctuary, Someshwar Wildlife Sanctuary, Talakaveri Wildlife Sanctuary, Jogimatti Wildlife Sanctuary, Timlapur, and last one, Yadahalli Chinkar Wildlife Sanctuary. And next we'll see wildlife sanctuaries in Kerala. Aralam Wildlife Sanctuary, Chimoni Wildlife Sanctuary, Chinnar, Chulannur, Idukki, Karinpuzha Wildlife Sanctuary, Kottayur Wildlife Sanctuary, Kurinjimala Sanctuary, Malabar Wildlife Sanctuary, Mangalavanam Bird Sanctuary, Neyar Wildlife Sanctuary, Parambikulam Wildlife Sanctuary. Pichi Vazaini Wildlife Sanctuary, Pepra Wildlife Sanctuary, Periyar, Shendurni, Tattekad Bird Sanctuary, Wayanad Wildlife Sanctuary. Next we'll see wildlife sanctuaries in Ladakh, Changtong Wildlife Sanctuary and Karakoram Wildlife Sanctuary. Only 2 wildlife sanctuaries are there. And next we'll see Lakshadweep. Lakshadweep also has 2 wildlife sanctuaries, Pitti Bird Sanctuary and Amini India Wildlife Sanctuary. Next we'll see wildlife sanctuaries in Madhya Pradesh, Bori Wildlife Sanctuary, Gandhi Sagar Sanctuary, Nauradehi Wildlife Sanctuary, National Chambal Sanctuary, Gatigon Wildlife Sanctuary, Kharera, Kengherial, Kalamandal Wildlife Sanctuary, Khioni, Narsingar Wildlife Sanctuary, Bagdara Wildlife Sanctuary, Orcha, Pampta, Pain Wildlife Sanctuary, Shailna, Sardapur, Singori, Songherial, Virangana Durgavati Wildlife Sanctuary, Panchamarhi Wildlife Sanctuary, Kuno Wildlife Sanctuary, Ratapani, Sanjay Dhubri, Gango Wildlife Sanctuary. And next we'll see wildlife sanctuaries in Maharashtra, Amba Bharwa Wildlife Sanctuary, Andhari Wildlife Sanctuary, Aner Dam, Bhamargarh, Bhimashankar, Bhor Wildlife Sanctuary, Bordharna Wildlife Sanctuary, Chaprala Wildlife Sanctuary, Diolgon Rekhuri Wildlife Sanctuary, Dagang Wildlife Sanctuary, Gangewadi New Great Indian Bustard Wildlife Sanctuary, Gotala Atramgarh Sanctuary, Godhzari Wildlife Sanctuary, Great Indian Bustard Sanctuary, Jayakwadi Bird Sanctuary, Kalsubhai Harishchandra Gad Wildlife Sanctuary, Karanj Sohal Wildlife Sanctuary, Karandla Wildlife Sanctuary, Karnalal Bird Sanctuary, Katepurna, Koka, Koina, Lunar, Malwan Marine Wildlife Sanctuary, Manasingedio Wildlife Sanctuary, Mayani, Mayureshwar, Melghat, Nagzaria, Naigon Maya Wildlife Sanctuary, Nandur Madhumaheshwar Wildlife Sanctuary, Narnala Wildlife Sanctuary, Navegon, New Nagzira Wildlife Sanctuary, Peganga Wildlife Sanctuary, Pansad Wildlife Sanctuary, Radhangari Wildlife Sanctuary, Radhanagari Wildlife Sanctuary, Sagareshwar, Sudhagad, Thamini, Thansa, Thin Creek Flamingo Wildlife Sanctuary, Tillari Wildlife Sanctuary, Tippeshwar, Tungareshwar, Umred, Karnangla, Van Wildlife Sanctuary, Yavan, Yedsi Rambling Ghat Wildlife Sanctuary. Next we'll see a wildlife sanctuaries in Manipur, Khongjangba Ching Wildlife Sanctuary, Yangopoki Lokochau Wildlife Sanctuary, Kailam Wildlife Sanctuary, Ziri Makru, Bunning, Jelad, Tinungei Bird Sanctuary. Next wildlife sanctuaries in Meghalaya: Bagmara Piche Plant Wildlife Sanctuary, Nonkelam Wildlife Sanctuary, Siju, Narpur Wildlife Sanctuary. Wildlife sanctuaries in Mizoram: Dampa Tiger Reserve and Kawanglang Wildlife Sanctuary. Lengteng Wildlife Sanctuary, Jangpui, Puleng, Tavi, Thorangatlang, Toklao Wildlife Sanctuary. Next we'll see wildlife sanctuaries in Nagaland: Pakim Wildlife Sanctuary, Konomo Nature Conservation and Trogopon Sanctuary, Pulei Basdie Wildlife Sanctuary, Rangpahar Wildlife Sanctuary, Singpan Wildlife Sanctuary. Next we'll see wildlife sanctuaries in Odisha: Badrama Wildlife Sanctuary, Baitarkanika Wildlife Sanctuary, Satkosi George Wildlife Sanctuary, Hadgar, Nandkanan, Baisipalli, Kotagar, Chandaka Elephant Sanctuary, Kalasuni Wildlife Sanctuary, Balukand, Konak Wildlife Sanctuary, Kuldia Wildlife Sanctuary, Debrigar Wildlife Sanctuary, Lakhari Valley Wildlife Sanctuary, Nalbana Bird Sanctuary, Sunabeda Tiger Reserve, Gahirmata Marine Sanctuary, Kalarpat Wildlife Sanctuary, Kapilsala Wildlife Sanctuary, Tikarpada Wildlife Sanctuary. Next we'll see wildlife sanctuaries in Punjab: Abohar Wildlife Sanctuary, Bir Aishwan Wildlife Sanctuary, Bir Badson, Bir Bunheri, Bir Dosanje, Bir Gurdailpura Wildlife Sanctuary, Bir Maheshwar Wildlife Sanctuary, Bir Motibhag Wildlife Sanctuary, Harike Lake Wildlife Sanctuary, Zazi Bacholi Wildlife Sanctuary, Katalor, Kashlin Wildlife Sanctuary, Takni Rehampur Wildlife Sanctuary, Nangal Wildlife Sanctuary. Next we'll see wildlife sanctuary in Pondicherry. There is only one wildlife sanctuary, Asudu Bird Sanctuary. Next in Sikkim: Yongonsla Alpine Sanctuary, Fambong Loho Wildlife Sanctuary, Shingba Rhododendron Wildlife Sanctuary, Menam Wildlife Sanctuary, Versailles Rhododendron, Pangolka Wildlife Sanctuary, Kittam Bird Sanctuary. Next we'll see wildlife sanctuary in Rajasthan: Darha Sanctuary, Desert National Sanctuary, Mount Abu Wildlife Sanctuary, Kumbalgha Wildlife Sanctuary, Tal Chapar Sanctuary, National Chambal Sanctuary, Sita Mata Wildlife Sanctuary, Pulwari Ki Naal Wildlife Sanctuary, Todgar Roali Sanctuary, Sajjangarh Wildlife Sanctuary, Basi, Bhan Bharetha, Bansrodgarh Wildlife Sanctuary, Jaisamant, Jamwa, Ramgarh Wildlife Sanctuary, Jawar Sagar Wildlife Sanctuary, Kaila Devi, Kesar Bhag, Kumbalgha, Nahargarh Wildlife Sanctuary, Ramgarh Vishdhari Wildlife Sanctuary, Ramsagar Wildlife Sanctuary, Savaimdhopur Wildlife Sanctuary, Savai Mansingh Wildlife Sanctuary, Sherghar, Van Vihar. Next we'll see wildlife sanctuaries in Tamil Nadu: Vedantangal Bird Sanctuary, Madumalai National Park and Wildlife Sanctuary, Point Calimere Wildlife Sanctuary and Bird Sanctuary, Indira Gandhi Wildlife Sanctuary, Kalkad, Mundanturai Tiger Reserve, Vettangudi Bird Sanctuary, Pulicat Lake Bird Sanctuary, Velnadu Wildlife Sanctuary, Grizzled Squirrel Wildlife Sanctuary, Kirkilai Bird Sanctuary, Chitrangudi, Kanjirankulam Bird Sanctuary, Vaduvur Bird Sanctuary, Udaya Martandapuram Bird Sanctuary, Kuntankulam Bird Sanctuary, Vellode Bird Sanctuary, Karaivetti Bird Sanctuary, Kanyakumari Wildlife Sanctuary, Satyamangalam Wildlife Sanctuary, Kodaikanal Wildlife Sanctuary, Kaveri North Wildlife Sanctuary, Osudu Lake Bird Sanctuary, Meghamalai Wildlife Sanctuary, Gangaikonda Spotted Deer Wildlife Sanctuary, Malaselvanur, Kilaselvanur Wildlife Sanctuary, Mundanturai Wildlife Sanctuary, Nellai Wildlife Sanctuary, Tirthangal Wildlife Sanctuary, Sakkarkottai Wildlife Sanctuary, Tanthai Periyar Wildlife Sanctuary. Next we'll see wildlife sanctuaries in Telangana. Pocharam Wildlife Sanctuary, Pakhal Wildlife Sanctuary, Ithur Nagaram Wildlife Sanctuary, Khawal, Kinersani Wildlife Sanctuary, Manjira Wildlife Sanctuary, Nagarjun Sagar Srishalam Tiger Reserve, Shivram Wildlife Sanctuary, Pranhita Wildlife Sanctuary. Next we'll see wildlife sanctuaries in Tripura. Tripahizla Wildlife Sanctuary, Trishna, Ghumti, Rowa Wildlife Sanctuary. Next we'll see wildlife sanctuaries in Uttar Pradesh. Chandraprabha Wildlife Sanctuary, Krishnapur Wildlife Sanctuary, Katarnia Ghat Wildlife Sanctuary, Ranipur Sanctuary, National Chambal Sanctuary, Bakhira Sanctuary, Kaimur Wildlife Sanctuary, Hastinapur Wildlife Sanctuary, Samaspur Bird Sanctuary, Suhagi Bharwa Wildlife Sanctuary, Kachwa Sanctuary, Okla, Saman Bird Sanctuary, Sandhi Bird Sanctuary, Vijay Sagar Wildlife Sanctuary, Patna Bird Sanctuary, Suhelwa Sanctuary, Lak Bahosi Sanctuary, Mahavir Swami Wildlife Sanctuary, Nawabganj Bird Sanctuary, Parvati Arga Bird Sanctuary, Sur Sarovar Sanctuary, Surhatal Bird Sanctuary, Turtle Wildlife Sanctuary. Next we'll see wildlife sanctuaries in Uttarakhand. Govind Pashu Vihar Wildlife Sanctuary, Kedarnath Wildlife Sanctuary, Ascot Musk Deer Sanctuary, Sona Nadi, Binsar, Masure Wildlife Sanctuary, Nandhur Wildlife Sanctuary. Okay, only 7 wildlife sanctuaries in Uttarakhand. Next in West Bengal, Chapramari Wildlife Sanctuary, Holiday Island Wildlife Sanctuary, Lothian, Mahananda, Sajnakali, Senchal, Balbapur Wildlife Sanctuary, Betwa Dahari Wildlife Sanctuary, Vibhuti Bhushan Wildlife Sanctuary, Ramnabhagan Wildlife Sanctuary, Chintamoni Khar Bird Sanctuary, Zori Phokri Wildlife Sanctuary, Raiganj Wildlife Sanctuary, Baksa Tiger Reserve, Mayur Zaharna Elephant Reserve. Okay, that's all about the wildlife sanctuaries in India. Thank you.